So I'm going to ask all of our panelists to switch their cameras on to ask them a few questions before we go to the audience questions. So audience, please do keep submitting your questions. Professor Miller, I just wanted to pick up on a few things that you said in your remarks, and you mentioned the rise in these climate-related lawsuits. And I'm just wondering, these lawsuits, are we seeing that they advance or they delay climate action in general?
Well, I think we should use every tool in the box to rise to the challenge, and climate litigation is a tool in the box. I think it does a couple of things. It can cut through the political rhetoric and the inaction of governments and corporations, as we've seen in the Netherlands case with Shell, and lead to very concrete outcomes, which are very positive. They also bring public opinion and public debate to the issues in a less political way, that the public will have a renewed interest in the issue when they see the courts beginning to take a view on it. Is it something in and of itself that's going to be the silver bullet? No. We know that court proceedings can take a lengthy time. There's not a lot of access to courts from communities who need access. And the judgments and the sort of implementation of the judgments can take time. But it's part of the parcel, and along with the public participation, it is part of holding governments and corporations to account. And so I think it is a significant development.
I'm just wondering, a leitmotif really through this symposium from yesterday and today has been about the adoption by the UN Human Rights Council of this right to a healthy environment, which, as you say, in Scotland will go into your human rights bill too. I mean, is that going to help lawyers, build cases involving environment and human rights, having that resolution?
Yeah, the experience, there's over 100 countries now have the right to a healthy environment somewhere in their legal system, their constitutions or statute. And it's that kind of pressure that came within the UN system itself, where the majority of member states already domestically had recognized the right to a healthy environment. So it became increasingly anomalous that this was not recognized at an international level by the UN. And it's a very positive watershed moment for the international human rights system. And it will, I think, lead to a number of things. One is it will give rise to supporting litigation for climate action. It will help cases being presented. It will present arguments to judges who will be looking for guidance and interpretation from a wider range of sources than has been the case so far. And judges also, they are not immune to a sense of the moment and a sense of what public expectation is, a sense of what maybe the public debate is and what's being debated in national parliaments, etc. So if they can hang a judgment on something that is maybe soft law at this stage, then it provides something for them to do that. And we're seeing the development of jurisprudence across many jurisdictions now, and courts look at each other to see how they're applying and developing the law in these times. So I think it is a very important resolution, and it will also give rise in countries to domestic laws and policies and strategies and action plans. And most importantly, it will help mobilize public opinion and the youth, that it will further empower them in all of their advocacy and their mobilization and holding governments to account. So it has a multifaceted dimension and potential for progress to be made.
I would also like to say to all of our speakers, please, let's do it the old-fashioned way. If you would like to add to what anybody has said, please just raise your hand there. Dr. Traidl-Hoffmann, you said something which I think was very concerning, which was about the rise in pollen. And I'm just wondering, have we got a direct link between climate change and the rise in allergies? Because people do seem to be suffering more from allergies than ever before.
Yeah, so we do have strong evidence that allergies are increasing with environmental impact. And by this, climate change is one part of the soup. I always say that we are exposed by a soup of environmental factors. And it's difficult to say, okay, this is only climate change and this part of percentage is only due to climate change. But we for sure know that heating up, temperature rise, we know that environmental pollution is impacting on pollen aggressivity. So pollen are more aggressive to pollution. So yes, climate change is impacting on the increment of allergic diseases, but not only. It's as I said, the whole soup.
Understood. I'm interested by this role for civil society, and I'm just wondering about initiatives such as the Fridays for Future. I mean, anybody who would like to have a go at how does this help drive organizational change? And I'm wondering what researchers and academics can learn from these sort of initiatives.
Well, I'll come in, seeing as I was the one that was sort of promoting the role of civil society. I think the Fridays for Future has been absolutely key in, raising with parents and with grandparents. These are the views of the upcoming generation, and can you look them in the eye and explain why you yourself, as the older generations, are not doing whatever it is you can, wherever, to hold the governments who are presently in power to account. And I think, along with the evidence before our eyes of droughts and fires and floods, there is a sea change in public opinion, which is ahead of many governments in their appetite for transforming approaches towards combating climate change. And I think, too, they give a lot of hope and a lot of confidence in the future that if, for example, the younger generation were turning away from this debate, we're disillusioned, we're cynical, then there's real cause for concern. But these Fridays for Future demonstrations actually do provide the necessary hope. And, as Andrew was saying in his keynote, without hope, which gives rise to action, which gives rise to further hope, which then gives rise to things actually being done. And for those who are resisting efforts to combat climate change, it weakens their position. So I think it's absolutely critical that Fridays for Future are recognized for being a very progressive development and should be supported by all the parents and grandparents as well.
Well, let me go to Bennett and then Christian and then to Claudia on this one. Bennett, first to you.
Yeah, I guess I'm taking more of a cynical position when it comes to Fridays for Future. I think a lot of young people right now, just from working in schools and with schools is the work of the third generation projects, that there's a lot of burnout already happening with young people, that they feel like there's too many issues to tackle. They have too little power. They don't have enough spaces. The anger that is kind of articulated through Greta, even though she is a controversial person in the climate justice movement at large, but nevertheless, the anger that is articulated is righteous in terms of how little has been afforded to young people to actually have any kind of say over climate policy, let alone what they're even being taught about climate change. I mean, let's bear in mind there's no mandated education in Scotland, let alone many countries, to actually teach about the sciences and beyond of climate change, which is a major issue and also a major platform ask, which is kind of a basic ask, and they're not even being given that. So I kind of question then, what are they being taught then about how society is taking their concerns, and if they're being belittled, and there is a bit of an ageist dynamic happening within that.
That's really interesting you say that, Bennett, because I've moderated at 2 conferences where there's been sections for young people, young people seen as the solution, and they're getting increasingly irritated that that's how they're positioned, and that they seem to see it sometimes as a box ticking exercise. I don't know whether that's something that you share, Bennett.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this, it kind of falls together at large with any group that is kind of bearing the brunt of this, is seeing that this is an intergenerational injustice that they're having to address, and they just kind of see forward their futures is just kind of littered with climate stress. And none of that is really being addressed head on. And it kind of speaks to a lot of other communities that also talk about their own stresses, and they're kind of tokenized then on these panels. You'll see a lot of Indigenous panels, for example, at COP26. No one's actually taking them that seriously, though, when they come to talking about knowledge systems that would inherently challenge a lot of Western institutions, including the UN, as to where they're starting from in addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah. Christian, please, your thoughts on the matter.
Perhaps, yeah, I'll try to be brief because the point is obvious. I wanted to respond to your question, Claire, what we can learn from them. And I was kind of struck by their impact. I think there were main demands were, at least in my kind of smallish community, they were quite popular for decades. So people that we already mentioned, so for example, climate ethics scholars were calling for that, and just few people were listening to them, or at least they had no impact. And then that, at least Germany, where I come from, that dramatically changed with Fridays for Future. And then there was not all of a sudden this large agreement on the issue, but it was a big public debate, and at least finally people started to listen. And I think then in that regard, academics can probably learn quite a bit in terms of what was mentioned earlier, coalition building, creating synergies. But I guess it's also crucial that those who are actually so severely affected themselves raise their voice. Although I see what Bennett just said, that if it just so if they are just given credits, but then nothing happens and they're not actually taken seriously, then that actually already again takes away some of the enthusiasm about that. And I think I also had a question for Andrew, but I guess we should first answer the questions here from the audience. So thanks.
Yes, absolutely. I'll go to Claudia and then we'll take some of the audience questions.
Yeah, I answered already some of the questions in the chat, but I wanted to emphasize that due to this Fridays for Future, a lot of other Fridays for followed, Health for Future, Scientists for Future. I think it was a needed start to make this subject more visible. And I think also the fact that we are sitting together today here is also in part reason because of Fridays for Future.
Yes, yeah. Well, let me take some of the audience questions, and apologies if you've answered them in writing. Andrew, there's one here which is, how should climate vulnerable developing countries, some of which struggle with fragile democratic systems, foster community-based adaptation and mitigation efforts that focus on a human rights-based approach?
That sounded an incredibly complicated question. Do you mind?
It was a really complicated question. And I think that the tenet of it is that they've got enough to do with many, many different, if I put it into my rather oversimplification, which apologies to the questioner, but I think it is that, they've already living in fragile democratic systems, they have many, many issues. So how on earth are they going to do adaptation and mitigation with a human rights-based approach?
Well, first of all, they need their resources to do so, and that comes back to our 100 billion that we're referring to, but not just that. It means that, how can they? I know it's a bit like a point we just had about asking people to be resilient, but if they can't do that, then they really are. Then they have to leave, because the areas are becoming so unbearable. But then again, if they do leave, then they should be provided with support. I absolutely get that it's difficult. What is happening, though, and then that was the point of the first part of my talk, is that conflict is making things worse. And therefore, the same areas, there's an incredible correlation between the worst hit areas affected by climate change and those most vulnerable to conflict. And therefore, they are suffering from both conditions. And I mean, so it is all the harder, but it is all the more necessary. But I mean, my point is that's where outsiders can come in a way that really is supportive, not prescriptive, consulting them on what they really need, and hopefully providing them either with the advice and the practices, if it's a way of reducing tensions between one community and another, or with the resources to come up with alternative means of income that are more viable in areas that are getting hotter or wetter or drier or whatever the particular function, whatever the main factor of climate change is in that particular place.
Claudia, this is a really interesting question. It seems to have an ethical element too. So perhaps Christian might want to come in too. But it's what happens if the protection of public health necessitates the restriction of certain human rights?
Yeah, there's the question of priorities in human rights. You know, I think it's really a very difficult question, because what comes above health? So I think one can think about this, not taking breaths, thinking about what is more important than health, because then you feel that there's nothing more than health at the end. I think it's not a question I can finally answer at that point, only with the fact that there's nothing above health for us.
Yeah. Christian, do you? It is a big ethical question here, isn't it? What happens if the protection of public health necessitates the restriction of certain human rights? This seems to me a very topical COVID question, where we have seen freedom of expression and assembly restricted because of health concerns. Christian, any thoughts that you would like to contribute?
Yeah, I think I have the boring answer that it depends. It depends, for example, on whose human rights we are talking about. So if these are the human rights of those who are, for example, already suffering from climate change, or those who have contributed very little, it seems very odd to then impose additional burdens on those for a public good. Though it would be possibly a different answer if these are the human rights of let's call them so very simplicity of the polluters. But then again, kind of I think it does depend on kind of which human rights are we talking about, and also the time scale that we're talking about here. So as you just mentioned, during COVID, there were some human rights were restricted on a temporary basis, but that's very different, I think, from more fundamental human rights infringements that are actually happen from climate change, or when you get sick or die. So I think, as Claudia just said, that's a tough issue of prioritization, and there are actually no good answers on that. But just, but it may be when within the human rights, there are probably some who are not as important as others, and then you somehow need to decide who's come first. But that heavily depends on the particular situation. So I actually don't have an answer.
Well, let me move to Claudia. So perhaps you do have an answer, a definite answer for this one, because it seems quite a straightforward question. Not that I know the answer. The question is, the numbers shown about mortality caused by fires, is the reason only the smog or also the fire itself? And are people further away also affected, is one of the questions, Claudia.
The first question is, yes, it was the fire and the causes of the fire on pulmonary diseases. And as I answered also in the chat, so you can closely look at the publication again. And the second, yes, by long distance transport, we have even effects of wildfires on the health of people that are apart from the fire. So this means by long distance transport, we have also health impacts we can measure.
So there's a question here which perhaps Christian and Bennett might like to take, but please do raise your hand if others are interested, which is, what is the role of scientifically developed countries in providing training in environmental sciences for countries at exceptional risk from climate change? I feel as if I'm like an auctioneer here, saying, "Have I got any takers? What's your bid?" But the question was for the role really of the developed countries in providing more training.
I'm happy to give a short answer to that. From a recent project I did with National Geographic, which had us working actually with climate journalists in Somaliland, we saw a lot of those internally displaced from working in those camps didn't even know the science behind why the world was around them was getting hotter, and actually a lot of the responsibility shifted to themselves, that they blamed their neighbors and themselves for cutting down trees to harvest charcoal just to kind of burn fire and to make food, which speaks to a kind of a very deep injustice not being witnessed by the rest of the world, that the people most impacted are blaming themselves and not the real power dynamics, and that's a serious problem. So in terms of scientific education around climate change, I certainly think that needs to be a priority, coming from institutions that are able to and certainly have the financial resources to help.
Mm. I was asking a few questions to Alan earlier about climate litigation. Andrew, I understand that you would like to make some remarks also about lawsuits, please.
Yeah, well, I got a question on our sort of panelist chat, and I do have views about that. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm actually not a remotely litigious person, but I see this as the way forward. I really do. Very, very interestingly, what happened earlier this year with Fox News, when a company that it had falsely accused of, called Dominion, of coming up with voting machines that had gone wrong, the company sued them. Fox News backed off so fast. They realized they were on foot. They could lose up several $1 billion as a result. This is the way to go. Now, in terms of the blatant disinformation that is being pumped out on climate change, I think you'd have trouble in American courts with the First Amendment. But there are other people and other courts that are less squeamish about that point. And I think when at this stage, I mean, it is beyond irresponsible. I mean, literally beyond irresponsible for them to be pumping out this disinformation, telling people that working on climate, that it is somehow wrong to do, that you're undermining people's futures by working on climate change. I think this is the way to go. And as I said, so it's not just the big law companies, the big oil companies. That's already happening, and it is scaring them. I mean, the only thing that they care about is their bottom line, their pocketbooks. So heavy legal action for the fossil fuel companies is clearly one thing, but those who are really enabling them, such as media, that is giving them the backup and giving the right-wing populist politicians the backup as well. It's this triad. It's the right-wing politicians, the right-wing media, and the fossil fuel companies working together. Legal action is the way to go, and I hope mass class action will be heading their way.
Well, I can't see any more questions coming in from the audience. Unless I have missed one, please tell me. So what I'd like to do now is to ask each of our speakers for their key takeaways in, well, I would say less than 2 minutes, if you were able to do that. Perhaps if I'm just going to begin with Claudia, who's at the top of my screen, so that's where my eye goes first. Claudia, your key takeaways for our audience as we begin to conclude this discussion on climate change and human rights.
It's very short. Climate change is a major threat for our health, and we have to act now.
Thank you very much for that tweet, I would say, in its brevity. Christian, what would be your key message to this audience?
Another difficult question. So I'd say I'll go for, I take away, or what I learned here during the 2 days is that build coalitions, and if nothing else helps, sue the people in charge who are not meeting their moral and legal duties.
Bennett.
I would say that climate change has already eroded many human rights, and perhaps the attention is just beginning to shift because maybe those with the most power are now beginning to see those changes too. So I think we need to be listening to people that have been seeing their rights eroded over quite a while now. Thanks.
Alan.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Claire. Well, I think my takeaways would be that, you know, we are seeing public opinion going through a sea change. I think just now we do have the tools in our hands, which are the commitments made by governments to human rights treaty obligations, to Paris Agreement, to the SDGs. And the key is for all of us to do whatever we can, however, to hold these governments to account, to implement the commitments that they have voluntarily already accepted, and replace those governments who are unwilling to demonstrate the political will with governments who will take the political will to implement their commitments and govern.
Andrew.
Thank you. On the first part of what I was talking about, conflict and human rights. First of all, the takeaway, I think it's got to be that these people have not been working together. I mean, the community that I'm part of now, the peace building community, we need to far more see how climate is playing a role in conflict, and then change or adapt our policies on conflict resolution to take that into account. But on the other hand, so do those who are working on environmental and climate change issues need to do things in a conflict-sensitive way and not do things that actually end up exacerbating the conflict by their well-meaning initiatives. On the other part of what I was talking about, the link between human rights and climate change, I've been speaking strongly for actually a few years about the need for a much stronger coalition between the environmentalists and the environment and the human rights guys. That there is progress in all of this, but we need to bring in many other actors as well, such as in the last point about 3 minutes ago about the corporate lawyers, because that is actually the way we're going to make some progress. And all of these things, there is progress, but so far we're just scratching the surface on all of them.
Well, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for answering the audience questions so clearly and giving such interesting speeches. But I'm now going to give the floor to Professor Marcel Jaspars from the Royal Society of Edinburgh and Professor Hans-Peter Zehner from the Leopoldina to give us the key takeaways from the 2 days of the symposium. So, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm just going to really thank everyone for their contributions today and over the last 2 days. Particularly thank you, Claire, as well, for moderating so well this morning and fielding all the questions and making sure that there were plenty of questions for every participant. I'd like to thank all the RSE staff and Leopoldina staff for organizing the event today, making it run so smoothly. I really saw a very thought-provoking discussion for researchers at all stages of their career were involved with this. I think it is vital we get this right. I think climate change is an existential threat and all avenues need to be explored. And I think climate justice and human rights is one essential aspect of that. So I'd like to thank you all, and I'll pass on to our colleague at the Leopoldina. Thank you.
Thank you. If our colleague was able to join us for the final remarks, that would be great. Professor Marcel Jaspars from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. We're being very Swiss with our timekeeping, so we have concluded a little earlier.
I think it's Hans-Peter Zehner that should be next.
Okay, apologies, Hans-Peter Zehner. That's my bad eyes on the not reading the subtitles clearly enough. I wouldn't want not to give Hans-Peter Zehner his final message. But unless you come very quickly, the program will be finished, I think. Professor Jaspars, if you'd just like to say the final word on behalf of everybody, I think that would be good for our audience.
Well, thank you again. Thank you very much. And I'm hoping that many of you will be involved in negotiations next week at COP26. I'll be there looking at all the ocean events. That's my particular area of interest. And if you do see me, say hello. And I would like to be able to discuss with you some more things on climate justice. I think it's a very fascinating topic. It's far outside of my own comfort zone, but I do believe that what I've heard the last couple of days have helped me a lot to try and understand what's going on in this field and how it can be used to get the justice that is so richly needed by the countries that are suffering the most. But then again, thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of the day and weekend. And those of you that are involved next week, please do make efforts to make this point come to the fore in the discussion. Thank you on behalf of the Royal Society of Edinburgh.
Thank you, everybody, and let's hope that COP26 is ambitious.